Lucas. Lucas, said Mr. Weasley, nodding coldly. Busy time at the ministry, I hear, said Mr. Malfoy. All those raids. I hope they're paying you overtime. He reached into Ginny's cauldron and extracted from a very amid and the glossy Lockhart books a very old, very battered copy of the Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration. Obviously not, Mr. Malfoy said. Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace to your name of wizard? To the name of wizard, if they don't even pay you well for it. Mr. Weasley flushed darker than either Ron or Ginny. We have a very different idea of what disgrace is the name of a wizard, Malfoy, he said. Clearly, said Mr. Malfoy, his pale eyes straying to Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who were watching apprehensively. The company you keep, Weasley, and I thought your family couldn't sink no lower. There was a thud of metal as Ginny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself at Mr. Malfoy, knocking him backwards into the bookshelf. Dozens of heavy spellbooks came thundering down on all their heads. There was a yell of, "Get him, Dad!" from Fred or George. Mr. Weasley was shrieking. Mrs. Weasley was shrieking, "No, Arthur, no!" The crowd scampered back, knocking more shelves over. "Gentlemen, please, please!" cried the assistant, and louder than all of them. Break it up there, gents! Break it up! Hagrid was waiting towards... Break it up, gents! Break it up! Hagrid was wading towards them through the sea of books. In an instant, he had pulled Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. He had pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. Mr. Weasley had a cut lip, and Mr. Malfoy had been hit in the eye by an encyclopedia of toadstools. He was still holding Ginny's old Transfiguration book. He thrust it at her, his eyes glittering with malice. Here, girl, take your book. It's the best your father can give you. Pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned to Draco and swept from the shop. You should have ignored him, Arthur, said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off his feet as he straightened his ropes. Rotten to the core, the whole family. Everyone knows that. No Malfoy's worth listening to her. Bad blood. That's what it is. Come on now. Let's get out of here. The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them from leaving, but he barely came to Hagrid's waist and seemed to think better of it. They hurried up the street, the Grangers shaking with fright, and Mrs. Weasley beside herself with fury. A fine example to set for your children, brawling in public. What Lockhart must have thought. He was pleased, said Fred. Didn't you hear him as he was leaving? He was asking that bloke from the Daily Prophet if he'd be able to work the fight into his report, and it was all publicity. There you go. But it was a subdued group that headed back to the fireside in the leaky cauldron, where Harry, the Weasleys, and all their shopping would be traveling back to the Burrow using Floo powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers, who were leaving the pub for the Muggle Street on the other side. Mr. Weasley started to ask them how the bus shops worked, but stopped quickly at the look on Mrs. Weasley's face. Harry took off his glasses and put them safely in his pockets before helping himself to Floo powder. It definitely wasn't his favorite way to travel.